February 16th, 1942. Raji Beach, Banka Island. The morning heat pressed down like a wet blanket, mixing the smell of ocean iodine with the thick smoke of burning ships on the horizon. I can still see those 22 women in their gray Red Cross uniforms, soaked in salt water and covered in sand. Matron Irene Drummond turned to her pale nurses, her voice steady against the wind. She told them to keep their chins up, that she was proud of them. They began walking into the shallow ocean. Behind them, the heavy metallic clack of Type 96 machine gun bolts being pulled back, clearing the sand from the breaches. Nobody panicked. The only sound was the tide hitting the backs of their knees. Then the crossfire started. The water around a 26-year-old nurse named Vivian Bullwinkle boiled white and red with the impact of the rounds. She went down hard. This is her story, and the secret she was ordered to take to the grave. You are going to see the bloody reality of the fall of Singapore and the desperate final escape ship that sailed straight into a trap. I will explain exactly how biology, a high tide, and the physical ballistics of a 6.5mm projectile allowed one woman to survive a firing squad at 10 meters. And you will see the disturbing detail that the official military reports actively scrubbed from the ledgers until 2019, proving that the worst enemy of historical truth is sometimes the Allied side itself. We were taught that history is written by the victors. What the books forget to mention is that the victors have the exact same need to hide their shame as the defeated. The truth of Raji Beach took 77 years to surface. If you want the version of this war that they do not put in textbooks, stay with me. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. To understand how those nurses ended up in the crosshairs, you have to look at February 1942. The British Empire considered the fortress of Singapore impregnable. When the Imperial Japanese Army shattered it, the evacuation was not an organized, heroic retreat. It was bloody chaos. Overcrowded ships sailed out without escort into waters dominated by enemy bombers. The Australian Army Nursing Service tried to get their staff out on a ship called the SS Viner Brook. It left port on February 12th with 300 people aboard, including 65 nurses. The problem was the Japanese military doctrine of the era. They did not recognize the Geneva Convention or standard prisoner of war rights. To their command, surrendering was the ultimate dishonor, and the life of a captive held zero value. Stepping onto that ship was supposed to be a lifeline, but they were sailing directly into an executioner's territory. The water was waiting for them. On the afternoon of February 14th, the Japanese bombers found the Viner Brook in the Banka Strait. It took just 30 minutes for the ship to slip under the waves. I remember the men talking about the heavy stench of raw, unburned diesel fuel choking the surface of the water. 12 nurses drowned in that first hour. The survivors swam for their lives, swallowing salt and thick oil, aiming for the shoreline of Banka Island. By the 15th, about 100 exhausted survivors had pulled themselves onto the sand of Raji Beach. They were a mix of civilian refugees, wounded soldiers, and 22 surviving nurses. The civilians decided to hike inland to find a local village and seek help. The nurses stayed behind on the beach to tend to the stretcher cases. They believed they were following the rules of war. They thought the worst of the dying was behind them. The nurses gathered the wounded men and built a massive Red Cross emblem out of debris on the sand. They thought that symbol was a shield. But to the Imperial Japanese Army patrol that arrived the next morning, that cross was nothing but a high-visibility target. A squad of 15 to 20 soldiers marched onto the beach, led by an officer carrying a drawn sword. They moved with mechanical discipline. The Japanese troops immediately separated the men who could still walk from the stretcher cases. They marched the walking wounded down the shoreline and forced them out of sight behind a rocky headland. The nurses stayed with the bedridden men, waiting under the baking tropical sun. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick with the smell of sweat and fear. We all know what happens when soldiers take prisoners out of sight and do not come back. Minutes later, the muffled cracks of rifle fire and short shouts echoed from behind the rocks. Then, silence returned to the beach. A few moments passed before the Japanese soldiers walked back around the headland. I can clearly picture the blinding sunlight catching the edges of their steel bayonets. The blades were dark red. The patrol stopped at the water's edge and began systematically washing the fresh blood off their weapons in the gentle surf. The rust-colored stains clouded the foam around their boots. They wiped the steel clean with cold efficiency. The 22 nurses watched this happen. They understood exactly what had just occurred behind those rocks, and they knew the men lying on the stretchers were next. The commanding officer wiped his blade, turned his attention away from the ocean, and looked directly at the women. The math of this war was about to collect. The soldiers ignored the nurses for a long minute and walked directly into the center of the camp. They stopped beside the wounded men lying helpless on the stretchers. Without a single word, they drove those freshly cleaned bayonets straight down into the bedridden soldiers. The muffled, wet thud of steel punching through canvas and hitting bone is a sound you never forget. There was no chaotic panic, just the rigid, clinical execution of men who could not stand up to defend themselves. The Japanese officer then wiped his blade again, sheathed his sword, and stared at the remaining prisoners. The 22 women stood there in their damp uniforms, the sand sticking to their boots. They were unarmed medics, clearly wearing the insignia of non-combatants, and they had officially surrendered under international law. None of that mattered to a command that viewed capitulation as a crime punishable by immediate death. The mechanics of what happened next relied entirely on unquestioning obedience. The Japanese officer gestured toward the open water with a sharp wave of his hand. He gave the order. The 22 nurses were instructed to turn their backs to the sand and walk straight into the sea. Not a single woman broke down, begged, or screamed. They maintained their discipline until the very end. Matron Irene Drummond looked at her team, the brass buttons of their gray uniforms catching the morning light, and gave her final order. She told them to keep their chins up. They marched forward until the warm, tropical water swallowed their ankles, then their knees, then their waists. They felt the ocean current pushing against their hips, staring at the empty horizon line. They waited for the inevitable break in the silence, knowing the guns were tracking their backs. Behind them, on the dry sand, the gunners settled behind the Type 96 light machine guns. We heard the heavy metallic click of the bolts sliding into place. Japanese infantry doctrine did not train gunners to hesitate for medical insignias. A 6.5mm projectile does not ask what side you are on, and it does not care about the Geneva Convention. This is where the historical record was heavily manipulated for decades. For over 70 years, the official military ledgers stated these 22 prisoners of war were simply shot in the back while trying to escape into the water. That is a fabricated lie. They were surrendered medics walking calmly to an organized execution, offering zero resistance to their captors. The truth was far more insidious than a simple firing squad. I want to know what you actually thought the Red Cross meant in this theater before you heard this. Drop it in the comments. The physical evidence analyzed in 2019 proved something far darker than a standard war crime. The women had their blouses forcibly torn before the march. The uniforms showed brass buttons ripped from the thick cotton fabric in ways that no bullet impact or flying shrapnel could ever cause. They were sexually assaulted before they were ordered into the sea. The official ledgers scrubbed this entirely from the history books, replacing the grim reality with a sterile tale of clean, heroic sacrifice. The myth tells us that the Japanese forces managed to bury this atrocity, hiding their war crimes from the world until the 21st century. That is only half the truth. The sickening reality is that the silence was strictly enforced from the very top of the Australian military command and the Allied tribunals. The cover-up started with the people wearing the same uniform. When 26-year-old Vivian Bullwinkle stood before the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in 1946, she was firmly silenced by her own side. Senior military officers pulled her into a quiet room before she testified and gave her a direct, unofficial order to omit the sexual assaults from her sworn statement. The establishment decided they needed to protect the pristine moral image of the fallen nurses for the grieving families back home. They deemed the raw truth too shameful for the conservative public of the 1940s to handle. The Allied High Command actively chose to rewrite the final, ugly moments of their own frontline soldiers. They forced the only surviving witness to lie by omission under oath on the stand. By silencing Vivian, they built an impenetrable logistical barrier in the official historiography, protecting the public reputation of the dead by explicitly erasing the worst of their suffering on that beach. To understand how she lived to face that tribunal, we have to go back to the water. The 22 women waded deeper into the ocean, their boots sinking into the soft sand. The tension on the beach spiked as the Japanese officer raised his hand. Every nurse knew the heavy guns were dialed in directly on their backs. They felt the cold water rising up to their waists, soaking the heavy gray cotton of their dresses. The silence of the morning broke, replaced by the mechanical tracking of the gun barrels panning across the shoreline. The air smelled strongly of salt, iodine, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil. The women kept their eyes fixed forward, refusing to look back at the men holding their lives in the balance. The officer held his hand high in the air for a long, unbearable second. To understand the exact cost of that government silence, we have to return to the morning of February 16th. The 22 women waded deeper into the ocean, their boots sinking into the shifting sand. The tension on the beach spiked as the Japanese officer raised his hand. Every nurse knew the heavy guns were dialed in directly on their backs. They felt the cold water rising up to their waists, soaking the heavy gray cotton of their dresses. The silence of the morning broke, replaced by the mechanical tracking of the gun barrels panning across the shoreline. The air smelled strongly of salt, iodine, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil from the cleared breaches. The women kept their eyes fixed forward, refusing to look back at the men holding the triggers. The tide was coming in fast, pushing cold waves against their hips. That incoming tide was the decisive physical detail that would change the course of history. As the water deepened around their legs, it physically altered the necessary angles of the incoming machine gun fire. The cold temperature of the sea also began to lower their core body heat, a strict biological factor that would soon prove critical for the only survivor in the group. The Japanese gunners rested their fingers on the heavy triggers, checking their iron sights one last time before the order. Matron Irene Drummond stood tall in the center of the line, the water lapping steadily at her heavy leather belt. The women braced their shoulders, waiting for the massive kinetic impact they knew was coming from the dry sand. The entire beach went dead quiet, stripped of all human sound except the crashing surf. What happens next took less than 4 seconds. 4 seconds that ended 81 days of fighting. The officer held his hand high in the air for a long, unbearable second. He locked eyes with the gunners, ensuring their barrels were swept across the full width of the 22 targets. The women stood trapped between the deep water ahead and the loaded weapons behind. Their options had evaporated. There was no cover, no trench, and no possibility of diving out of the fatal funnel. They simply had to stand there and accept the incoming fire. The morning sun beat down on their wet hair. The rusted smell of the blood from the bayonets mixed with the fresh ocean breeze. The officer dropped his arm in a sharp, downward motion. The gunners squeezed the triggers on the Type 96 machine guns, sending hundreds of 6.5mm rounds tearing through the humid air toward the gray uniforms. The math was finally collected. 10 straight seconds of sustained automatic fire ripped across the shallows. The water splashed white and red as the bullets hit the surface. The women dropped into the surf one by one, cut down from behind with nowhere to run. A 6.5mm round caught Vivian Bullwinkle square in the left hip, right above the waterline. The impact delivered a deep, burning sting of hot metal crossing muscle tissue. The kinetic energy snapped her balance instantly, sending her plunging face first into the salty water. She hit the surface with the taste of copper and sea salt flooding her mouth. Her body went into immediate physiological shock. Every nerve ending fired, telling her lungs to gasp, to inhale the ocean water. She forced herself to go entirely limp, floating in the spreading red foam, while the deafening echoes of the machine guns slowly faded across the beach. She suppressed the most basic human instinct to breathe, understanding that the slightest ripple in the water meant a bayonet through her spine. She held her breath until her chest burned, listening to the heavy boots of the Japanese patrol wading through the shallows. They were walking among the floating bodies, inspecting the gray uniforms to ensure the job was done. She lay face down in the warm tide, feeling the water wash over the bullet hole in her hip. She controlled the pure panic through sheer force of will, playing dead while the soldiers laughed and talked just meters away from her head. If she flinched, if she coughed up the salt water in her throat, she would join the 21 women resting on the sea floor. She stayed frozen in the gentle current, waiting for the splashing boots to retreat to the dry sand. Let me tell you why she survived a machine gun burst from 10 meters away. Standard infantry doctrine states a round fired at that range usually shatters the spinal column or ruptures vital organs, dropping a soldier instantly. But the bullet hit Vivian's hip at a specific angle, punching clean through the muscle tissue without severing a major artery or hitting the bone. It caused extreme pain, but not an immediate lethal hemorrhage. The physical force threw her forward into the waves, and that is what saved her life. The cold ocean water clamped down on her vascular system, naturally slowing the bleeding from the entry wound. Biology, a high tide, and the physical ballistics of a grazing shot aligned perfectly. She floated inert for long minutes, letting the tide carry her limp body back toward the shallows. The mechanical cause and effect gave her a narrow window to live. She remained motionless in the red foam until the heavy sound of the Japanese patrol faded entirely into the dense jungle. Vivian slowly lifted her head from the surf, her ears still ringing. She dragged herself onto the wet sand. The bodies of her friends washed up around her, their gray dresses tangled in the tide. She crawled into the jungle and found British Private Pat Kingsley, another bleeding survivor from the first massacre. For 12 days, they endured a sensory hell hidden in the thick vegetation. They drank drops of water squeezed from rotting moss. The gangrenous rot in their untreated wounds smelled like sweet decay, drawing insects by the thousands. The intense thirst swelled their tongues until they could barely swallow, and the heavy humidity made every breath feel like pulling water into their lungs. The pain in Vivian's hip throbbed relentlessly. They quickly realized that starvation and infection would kill them long before the Japanese soldiers ever did. They needed food to survive, so they staggered out of the tree line and surrendered to a different Japanese unit. Before they approached the guards, Vivian made a brilliant tactical decision that saved her life. She took the belt of her torn cotton dress and tied it as tightly as she could directly over the bullet hole in her hip. She concealed the wound entirely, pretending she had never been on Raji Beach that morning. She knew the mechanics of their enemy. If this new command realized she had survived the massacre, they would execute her on the spot to eliminate the only living witness. The blood soaked into the tight belt, but the dark gray fabric of her uniform hid the stain. She stood tall, fighting the blinding pain in her side, and presented herself simply as a shipwreck survivor. The guards bought the story and loaded them onto a truck. Her desperate gamble worked, but the cost was monumental. Private Pat Kingsley succumbed to his severe wounds shortly after. Vivian was sent to the Palembang and Belalau prisoner of war camps in Sumatra, where she spent the next 3.5 years surviving malnutrition, rampant malaria, and exhausting forced labor. Her body withered down to 32 kilograms, her bones pressing against her skin, but her mind stayed sharp. Through the hunger, she managed to keep secret diaries hidden from the camp guards, writing down the names of the 21 women left floating in the tide. She survived the war, earned the rank of lieutenant colonel, and became the director of nursing. But the mental cost of that forced silence was an indescribable, heavy isolation. She carried their final words, the memory of their torn uniforms, and the reality of their last minutes without ever sharing the full burden. She smiled for the cameras and accepted the medals, while the ghosts of 21 nurses stood silently right behind her. The Australian government gave her a chest full of ribbons, but they locked her memories in a vault. It was not until 2019 that historians Lynette Silver and Tess Lawrence finally broke the 77-year secret. They examined Vivian's uniform, kept under glass in Canberra. The brass buttons were ripped off, the heavy gray cotton torn in ways inconsistent with bullet strikes. Secret letters confirmed the government gag order. This revelation changed how we study war crimes, proving that Allied nations will erase the gendered violence suffered by their own troops simply to protect public morale. They protected the reputation of the dead by explicitly erasing the worst of their suffering, leaving Vivian to carry the deep humiliation of her colleagues entirely alone for the rest of her long, quiet life. The Banca Island massacre fundamentally shaped our memory of the Pacific War, but it took nearly 8 decades to get the real story right. Today, Vivian Bullwinkle is the first woman to have a solo statue standing on the grounds of the Australian War Memorial. Her gray uniform still sits under that thick glass in the museum, bearing the bullet hole in the hip and the torn brass buttons. It serves as a silent piece of physical evidence, proving that official history is only the version they let us read. We remember the 21 women who did not walk out of that water, and we remember the one who carried their secret until the very end. The truth always leaves a mark, even if it takes 77 years to find it. If this story deserved to be told, make sure someone else gets to hear it.